Yeah, so the final 6 months before leaving for Zambia were more relaxed because I knew I had a job. I can still remember the day when I rushed down the drive of Sutherland Street to get the post with my contract from Zambia. I was anticipating it. How excited we were. Going back to Africa had always been a dream, and I always wanted to take Maria there, of course. And as a principal of a school. In the meantime, we spent 6 months trying to get ourselves Australian citizenship. This was because, as a permanent resident of Australia, should we leave Australia, we would have had to return within a 2-year period, or we would have lost our permanent residence. In order to obtain an Australian passport, though, we were very fortunate to meet a federal government Labour member for Parliament, Mr. McClelland, I remember, and he had relatives, believe it or not, in Dundonald in Belfast, and that was the connection, and he assisted us. So basically, I explained to him that I had to leave Australia. Why? Because I couldn't get a job in Australia. Well, we eventually got our citizenship and our photos in the local press. I was again impressed by the sympathetic response to our plight from an official in the government, in this case, of course, a Labour government, and a federal member of Parliament. Officialdom in Australia in those days was very much more in touch with ordinary people, much more so than in the United Kingdom or Ireland. And this was an aspect of Australia which I really appreciated in those days. But I'm afraid it has all changed in the past 15 years. The Liberal Party and the people who have been seduced and enticed to support them in the final decade of the 20th century and then in the last 20 years of this millennium, the Liberal Party have destroyed the traditional connection between the less fortunate citizens and the government. In my opinion, those Liberal politicians, such as John Howard and their supporters, should be held accountable. The Liberal leaders, particularly Howard, should be tried as criminals for corrupting the middle class. The middle class, in particular the tradies in Australia, were seduced and enticed by Liberal policies which appealed to greed and selfishness. And they are all now proud owners of an SUV and 2 houses worth $500,000 each, while the rest of us can't scratch 2 halfpennies together. That's the problem with our democracy. It has encouraged people to be selfish and has given them the moral legitimacy to be greedy. Then, of course, the media and business and even the civil institutions, such as schools and even the church, have been persuaded too. Well, I packed up all my belongings into 40 boxes, 40, and 6 suitcases, and I headed for Zambia, leaving Maria and the kids behind in the freezing winter with skeleton furnishings, eating off a few plastic plates. The children won't remember this, but Maria will. The plan was for them to follow in a fortnight after I had given the all clear from Zambia. One thing was for sure, I was not going to repeat the same mistake I had made in coming to Australia, of arriving with all my family, including a pregnant wife, without the resources to get out in an emergency. I caught the plane to Harare in Zimbabwe via Perth. I had decided to pack everything in 44 boxes and leave them in Sutherland Street ready for collection until I sent word to Maria from Lusaka in Zambia. The first shock was on my arrival at the airport in Lusaka. There was a long queue waiting to go through immigration. I could see a white man at the front of the queue on the immigration side, and I somehow guessed that this was my director, Funky. He seemed to be arguing with some officials. Not perhaps surprising, as it was Africa after all. But as I got closer to the front of the queue, I could see that the argument was becoming more animated. Moreover, Funky seemed to be swaying on his feet, back and forth from left to right. His face looked flushed. He was clearly under the influence of alcohol. It struck me as a little strange to be drunk when meeting your second in command, but I dismissed the thought quickly. Undaunted, I put out my hand in greeting. To my surprise, he didn't even take it. He just started talking to me, complaining about some problem he was having with an official. I had just completed a 24-hour journey and was perhaps not in the best of shape myself. He ushered me to the car park of the airport, where a group of Africans descended upon the Land Rover and lifted my bags into the back. It was pitch black. I knew I was in Africa again. I was excited. We left the park at high speed in his four-wheel drive, with Funky cursing and swearing at the airport officials. As we started down the road, the next thing I knew, I could see flashing lights approaching us. They passed us on the other side of the road, but then they doubled back to follow us. The next thing I knew, a police motorcycle had overtaken us and ditched us onto the side of the road. It seemed like the president had just arrived at the airport and everybody was being cleared off the road. There then followed an altercation between the inebriated Funky and the policeman on the motorcycle. It sounded quite ugly, and I was worried about perhaps spending my first night in a cell. But Funky seemed to win the argument in the end, and we sped on home. The first thing Funky did was offer me a drink. He then proceeded to tell me that our house, which was being renovated, was not yet ready. Now, we had been shown a lovely house in Melbourne of a photograph which looked very nice indeed and ready to be occupied. Anyway, he said it was not yet ready. Later, he elaborated. But after a few minutes, he suddenly took down a photo of the staff of the school, and it was a very big school, and started to go through them one by one with his finger, making comments such as, "He's useless," or "She's a bitch." I was numbed by it all. I eventually made my excuses and went to bed. I had been back in Africa for about 3 hours, but anxiety kept me awake for most of the night. In the morning, I woke to American hospitality. Yeah, make your own breakfast. The coffee is there. The milk's in the fridge. That sort of thing. It reminded me of Canada. I can't remember other details much. I remember Funky taking me to the renovated house and announcing that there were no doors, no windows, no plumbing, no electricity. Okay, so what really concerned me though was that there was little discussion as to where Maria and the 3 children would stay while all this was sorted out. Funky and his wife had no children. They therefore didn't understand how a family man's mind works, which is wife and children first, then me. Not that he was really a bad host. He had an expansive, typically American generosity, but only with the school's money. So he took me to restaurants, etc. But where he had to produce a brick of banknotes to pay for the meal. Yes, literally, there was so much hyperinflation that in order to pay for a meal, you had to have your hand full. We called it a brick of banknotes. The real problem, though, was the school. It seemed that Funky was in the middle of a fierce tussle with the chairman of the board. I was not really able to get to the bottom of it properly, but I got close enough to know that I didn't like the sound of it. The next thing I knew, I was asked to attend meetings with Funky himself and the half of the board who was not on holiday. The chairman and the other half were on holiday. It subsequently turned out that the board was split in half. Half of them supported Funky, but the other half wanted him out, including the chairman of the board. After I returned to Australia, the chairman, the leader of the anti-Funky group, contacted me and asked me if I would return to Zambia and replace Funky if they got rid of him. Meanwhile, Funky drank heavily each night, and on one occasion he was really quite rude to a newly recruited young female teacher who was staying in his house for a couple of nights because her accommodation wasn't ready either. I think this was the last straw, I don't know, or maybe I just lost my nerve, I don't know which. But I decided in my mind that I was not going to risk bringing the family out to this situation. I just didn't trust Funky. I didn't have the confidence that he could be relied on. I had 3 small children. I knew once we arrived in Africa we could not go back again, as I did not have enough money. just like in Melbourne, in fact. Once bitten, twice shy. The problem was Maria had her heart set on coming to Africa, and it was such a disappointment for her to hear my news from Zambia. It almost broke her heart and mine when I told her how things were. She had already said goodbye to everyone in Melbourne and was counting the minutes till she could leave Melbourne forever. Even getting back to Australia from this position was going to be difficult for me because I had no money. I used a bit of guile and persuaded Funky to reimburse me for my original baggage allowance from Australia, even though I had not actually ordered the baggage to be sent yet. I claimed I needed the local money until my salary was paid, which was true, of course. So it was a white lie. Sometimes white lies are necessary in life. I then used this money to purchase a one-way ticket back to Melbourne. After only 5 weeks, I persuaded Funky that because of the delay in the arrival in my family due to the house not being ready, I would have to return to Melbourne to sort out a problem with our rental accommodation. This was another white lie. It was just an excuse, but he bought it. When I got back, it was to a dejected Maria in an almost empty house in Sutherland Street. We decided it would be too risky to proceed. I faxed Funky. He then called, but he was philosophical, I think he knew. He asked me, "What are you going to do?" And I said, "I'm going to go underground for a while." By that I meant I was going to disappear from the international school scene. I'd had enough of it. My brother called from Ireland. Being 7 years older than me, my brother had always had quite a formal relationship with me. We never really hung out together as children or teenagers. I don't think he had a high opinion of me because he had always thought that I was too adventurous. After all, I had ignored his advice about going to Australia in the first place. But he has a sound heart and is probably the most straightforward, if very conventional, of all the Nixons. Mum used to say, Roger would always try to do the right thing. Yes, he offered to help me out financially with the move from Melbourne and the search for another job. Certainly, from our point of view, one thing in his favour was that, having no children himself and a working wife, he was loaded, which I was not. I could hear my voice breaking on the phone as we spoke. I almost broke down, and this caused us both embarrassment. Nixons simply don't cry. My brother was certainly very uncomfortable, and I could hear the irritation in his voice. I've never seen a member of the Nixon family shed a tear apart from myself, although this was actually the second time because I had broken down in my office a few days before my resignation in Melbourne. Within 3 weeks, we were in Queensland and had left Melbourne forever.